everybody from Southeastern Europe, but also from across the globe. As you know, our hub is focused on Southeastern Europe, but we are part of the global Urban by Nature program for urban nature pioneers. So we are very glad to welcome all the attendees from various cities and countries. I have a small problem with moving my slides. Okay. Today we will have the great honor to welcome and talk and discuss with our presenters. It is Sean Bradley, the Clever Cities Program Manager from Groundwork London, our Clever Cities partner, and another representative from the Southeastern region, Dr. Barbara Goličnik, Head of Research from Urban Planning Institute of the Republic of Slovenia. And my name is Ana Mitić-Radulović, and on behalf of Center for Experiments in Urban Studies from Belgrade, I will be facilitating this webinar today. I will have to make several technical notices. This webinar is being recorded and there is the interpretation allowed. You can see in the panel the interpretation icon, at least you should see it. I don't see it at the moment, but if there is a problem, I would ask our colleagues to post the instructions in the chat box. There is also the questions and answers panel, and during the entire webinar, you will be able to post your questions or in the chat box or in the questions and answers. And after the presentations are being delivered by our panelists, we will have the opportunity for discussion. As you probably know, this is the second webinar, which will be focusing on the step 3 of the Urban by Nature methodology. And we are somewhere in the middle of our Urban by Nature pathway that we planned for this cycle of activities and discussions together with our partners from the Southeastern Europe region. But the following webinar will be in October, and we will announce it at the end of this meeting. And now I would like to give the floor to Sean to present his experience in London in implementation of the Clever Cities project, but also some more overarching ideas and digital tools that are being developed for planning the co-creation in other environments as well. Sean, please go ahead. I will stop sharing my presentation and ask you to share your slides with us.
Okay, sharing now. Please let me know when that's visible.
Yes, it is. Great, thank you.
So I decided to focus this presentation quite specifically on the topic, prioritizing goals. So I didn't take a broad reach, as if this was the topic that the hub is focused on. So I really brought it down to the detail of that level. So as mentioned, I'm Sean. I do the lead on the co-creation aspect of the project. So I'm the Clever Cities Program Manager at Groundwork. And Clever Cities London is focused on South Thamesmead, which, as you might observe from this image, is not very representative of London. It's a lot less dense. It was a 60s and 70s futurist neighborhood that was designed, but with good intentions in the 60s, which means poor design from the 2020s. It was really not designed well from a humanistic perspective, but there is a fair amount of green space, which is interesting, but not within the actual building areas. So it's quite a contrast. And Clever Cities is a program that works to put in nature-based solutions and then measure the change in social dynamics more than measuring the changes in biophysical reactions and stuff. We know that plants can clean water now. Now we just want to prove a bit more evidence on social change. So that was a huge focus. So I would like to talk about first the difference between deep engagement and wide engagement as a precursor to talking about priorities, because deep engagement, of course, means just diving in with a few people that will be intensely occupied in the process, because not everybody in the community can be intensely occupied. They all have different issues, families, work. Not everybody is apt for that. Versus the wide-reaching connection that you try to make with the whole of a community, so everybody has a chance to speak to the project, but obviously not all the components. So, what is the balance between these two? How do you do that as a precursor to looking at your priorities? You have to priorities with who? With your deep, maybe your community design panel, or with your wide, trying to speak to the whole community. It's always an issue. Again, just clarifying then what I just mentioned. So wide engagement is when you consult a significant part of the community, and then we're looking at least trying to raise awareness through social contact. So I consider a success in a neighborhood when I speak to people and they know from somebody through 3 or 4 contacts, they've at least heard of a project. That's successful. You'll never get everybody involved, but at least most people have heard of it. That's a huge success from wide engagement. Deep engagement, as I said, is getting representatives who act as co-clients, who talk about budget, who talk about detailed design. These are community leads, and it's usually a smaller group of representative people, but who can actually get involved in the project week after week and make decisions together as part of the design team, and really empowering that smaller group of people. And there's things in the middle as well. Social groups that you might consult 3 times or 4 times or 2 times during a process and do some design sessions, or a school drop-in, or you might speak to somebody at an event a couple times, but it's not just that one-off contact of the wide engagement, nor is it the deep contact where you have a community design panel, for example. So again, it's always this balancing act that you have to do, and then you have to bring that forward into the prioritization process. And of course, there's a range of motivational alignments with these things. There's wide engagement usually involves having to convince people to stop with coffee and music because they're busy. And like I said, they're not that particularly engaged. Whereas people in deep engagement, you might actually have to pay them a salary and get them involved in another way. But often their goals are aligned with you. They might be environmentalists already and things like that. So goal alignment is an important aspect of this. And then talking about goals. So we have to understand what goals are. Okay, so they're a forward-looking element, but they're also about reducing the scope of your options. So a project can go in any direction initially. Everything's on the table at first, but then you will do nothing. So you have to really understand a goal isn't something to be putting you, limiting you, or to be tested on, or something that's really, you'll get punished if you don't reach. It's really about focus and getting people to concentrate on lesser options, to give their energy to fewer options and letting other options go by. So it's a positive energy, a motivational tool more than anything. Furthermore, it sets up the idea of prioritizing and celebrating the moves that you're going to make, the moves forward. Like I said, it offers incentives because they're usually associated with improving the quality of life. That's what you're trying to do for most goals, either to solve problems or to add aspects of quality of life. And it's one of the key aspects of connecting people in through participation, motivation through participation, buy-in, validation. As soon as people feel that their ideas are being heard, a lot of project resentment and things like that falls by the wayside as people start to feel that their ideas are being implemented and not ideas from outside. So looking at this list, it's and I'm with, it's a list of different forward projecting ideas. I don't consider them particularly different. A lot of people seem to think that visions or policies are something special, but they're not. They're all just talking about either two things. They're either talking about a projection into the future, so if you how you see the future, or an intention to get to a future. So when you're talking about an outcome, you're talking about describing the future, a future scenario. So the world will be in a certain way. When you talk about a goal, you're talking about your intent on getting there. So there's really no difference between any of these words, as they're all future looking, except that they, as you go down this list, they increase in detail. So visions are sort of vague ideas. We want to make our neighborhood livable. So a vague notion, we want to make it inclusive, so general words. Whereas as you go down the list, a goal will be a bit more specific. And whereas an objective will be even more specific and have a time. And then once you get to actions, you're starting to add more and more to these things. So understanding that this is a scale of detail and that you have to move between them is one of the first things before prioritizing, because you might be talking about ideas that are very loose and should be talked about in terms of a vision rather than a goal. So you have to know to move up and down this scale quite well. At a certain point, like I said, it's become quite popular to talk about outcomes and then do backwards mapping. So you talk, it's a bit more positive to talk about a future scenario, how this neighborhood is ideal, and envision a positive scenario rather than focus on problems. Oh, we don't have green, or we have holes in our paving, or parking's an issue. So instead of talking about the negatives, it's become quite popular to talk about a positive vision and then work your way backwards to the goals that will get you to that. That's, called most commonly as a theory of change. So outcomes and outputs are forward projections in which you do backward mapping, whereas goals and objectives tend to focus either on problems or issues and talk about what you're going to do right now. We plan to implant a few thousand square meters of wildlife, of wildflowers. So that's a projection that's not describing the future. So those are all important. Once you get to outputs and objectives, you start to usually put numbers on these things. So you start to talk about how many square meters, how many trees planted, number of systems, people affected. So that's where we start to get either parameters or indicators that will help you move forward and measure your next cycle. And the last two, actions and activities, are really when you start to say who will be doing them and with what resources. So that means, do they have space? Do they have the funds? Do they have the infrastructure? Do they have a phone to call with? Is that being paid for? Do they have transport? Do they have all those things to make those objectives come forward? It starts to separate out into at least 10 or 12 different resources that make an action or an activity. It's still forward thinking. It's not implementation yet. You're still talking about what you're going to be doing, but you're doing it very specifically now with resources. So I think this is an important context to understand before you really sort of dive into prioritizing. So typically, the more you're talking about vision and general things like, oh, we want to make our neighborhood more healthy, you need wide engagement, as I was talking about before. You have to have the whole community involved in those things. And as you get down into talking about specific objectives, you deal with a smaller group of people more intensely. So that also works in that way. And there's also the sense that if the issue is very impactful for the community, you also have to have wider engagement, or if the problem is very complex, it also tends to push you towards wider engagement. So all these things are quite interconnected. Then the quality of the information. So this is another issue. People, when you go to the community, you start getting, people think all information from the community is valuable. It's not necessarily. People come up with crazy ideas. It depends on a learning process, and people get better and better at it, but not everybody's ideas, not your ideas, not my ideas, nobody's ideas are good all the time. So you get a mix of ideas, and they can be in different scales again. So if somebody says, oh, it's very gray here, it's sort of just, okay, that's not very specific. And then you'll get somebody else in the same meeting saying, okay, I want to increase the greenery. It's more specific. So you can't compare necessarily these two ideas when you're talking about prioritizing things later. You have to try to get things on a somewhat level playing field in terms of the level of detail before you start trying to push things up and down. So there's often quite a bit of pre-work that has to be done. Even more specific, plant 10 new trees. We've already gotten down to sort of objectives or outputs where we've started to put numbers beside things. So you have to find your position on this scale before you start prioritizing. And then as you move out from that, it means that there isn't one event for prioritizing. In an ideal world, you'll do various cycles where you'll go back and forth, either with your small group or with the larger community group, again, depending on where you're talking about on the more detail or less detail. And you have to do cycles, like I said, of feedback, clarification to try to get your priority ideas on the same level. There's cycles of learning and training, so people start to be more sophisticated about urban regeneration. We did this in London. We had training in urban design and how to collaboratively make decisions about the regeneration process. We did that with our deep engagement group, with our small group, not with everybody, but you could open that up. And the more that you cycle people in and out of your deep engagement, you get more people with talent in your community that are comfortable talking about regeneration, urban regeneration, and then cycles of validation. You take it back to the original group and say, well, these are what we understood that you prioritized, or that you thought these were the words that you were using. Are these the right words? So you're just verifying. Finally, you get to prioritization. It's after you've done a lot of this back work, where if you have the time, because sometimes you don't have the time, you may be only able to do 1 or 2 meetings, so you won't be able to do much training. You have to do as much of that as possible, but the process is never ideal. So you'll do as best as possible, but eventually you get to prioritization, and you can keep cycling back and moving down from visions to scopes to goals to objectives, and trying to get more and more detailed, going back and forth to your community groups, either in a wide sense, but more often in a deep sense with a smaller, intensely involved group. But you want to do both, and back and forth. And eventually you'll break forward towards implementation and start doing some work and doing parts or components and those same objectives and parameters associated with those objectives will become part of your evaluation process. So cycling and then breaking out, cycling and then breaking out for implementation. So priorities within the community, it's very important, obviously, that they're of a collective importance. We have to be very careful about avoiding people becoming associated with specific interests only and not positions. You want to avoid people starting to say, well, my position is this. You want people to talk about the problem and try to get everybody on the same side of the table and solve the problem, not what your position is, not what you want. What is the problem? Try not to let people to talk about their positions and their interests. You try to keep people focused on what are the issues and what are the problems. So again, separating people from the problem, focus on interests and solutions, but not on positions. And then try to be creative and do a lot of brainstorming and create a lot of options that you can discuss on the table before trying to make a decision. Give people many options and discussions. So that's why they cycle back and forth and do a lot of that. And finally, try to discuss how these things will be objectively chosen. It might be voting and things like that, but it might be, let's say, on a interrelationship diagram with a systems thinking, where you look at different systems and what's impacting what more. You could use that as your criteria before you vote. If you vote, you might be able to choose just on objective criteria without voting and position making. So I see my time there is already rushing out.
It's okay. It's okay.
So again, you start wide with your visioning with the whole community, and you scale down to probably less people focusing on objectives. And one thing to be clear, when you make choices that damage community relationships, where people are absolutely furious with other people, aren't good choices. Okay, you have to find solutions that don't damage the relationships. The relationships are probably more important than the decisions. You can come back to those decisions later, but you can't recreate positive community relationships. So yes, typically the deep group, the group of smaller people that are involved every day or who are really involved, your smaller group of people who are representatives of the community, they should help you in all of these processes, and they can even help you analyze the ideas that come from the wider group of people, the community people. So the deep helps evaluate the wide. Finally, on this topic, just some tools. So obviously, even just discussion or counting people's ideas or how many people mentioned a certain objective, that already gives you a certain prioritization. But you can do ranking, and you can put tagging where people have 3 votes where they put little stickers on things. You can survey people. You can do, like I said, systems diagrams are becoming more and more popular, more interesting, where you put the relationships on a big board collectively together to talk about what's influencing what. And then you can start to identify where the levers are, where the key issues are. And that objectively helps focus people for a possible further vote. So positive comment tallies, there's a whole bunch of ways of prioritizing specifically. And then that stops what I had for my 50 minutes of talking about prioritizing objectives. So I'll just announce that we are working together on what's called Task Force 6, a group of a number of Horizon 2020 projects. There's at least 10 or 15 of us, all groups like Clever Cities, Network Nature, other groups that are all involved to a degree. And we've been creating an online decision support tool where I'll just show you some of the topics that are being addressed in this tool. We'll be able to click on these different subjects and get not the answers, but it'll ask you to think about the process. It'll say, have you considered this? Have you thought about that? So this is different in the sense that this is talking about the whole co-creation process and not prioritization. You see there's all these different steps where you look at the systems context, where you look at the stakeholders, where you do diagnostics, you do some project exploration. There's some visioning, so that would involve some prioritization in E4. You look at your first governance structure and you keep moving forward. So there's all these different sections. There's a specific topic on goals and objectives in orange there. And when you do validation, that's also a process of prioritization typically. So there's all these topics, again, that you'll be able to click on in this tool. And getting to co-implementation. So this just shows you the range of the topics that are going to be on this tool. You'll be able to click on any of these objects and look at these. So this is all going to be online, free access, open access. This won't be controlled by anything that's part of the European Commission's demands. It won't look exactly like this, but if you click on something like participatory culture, again, is your community already top down? Are they used to having community groups working? So it's asking that question. Consider your context. It's your starting point. It's like as a doctor, you have to make a diagnostic on how you're going to proceed. You have to look at the patient. In this case, it's the context of your community. How many people are already ready to participating? Are your governmental organizations already locked into doing it top down, or are they open to having some experimentation? So as you choose options, you can also look and get technical information. You see there's case studies, there might be policy summaries. So this is all just showing, again, as you click through, you'll get more detailed questions. So is there institutional pressure for participation? So it's asking you questions. It's asking you to think about options. It's not giving you the solutions other than the tech notes. And then you can choose another option and proceed through. And there's tools on how to, for example, do prioritization, et cetera, et cetera. I just wanted to show this last section. Now this was quite different, and I will be done with that, I believe. Yes, so thank you very much. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Sean, for this really profound and in-depth reflection on the conceptualization of how to engage stakeholders and how to jointly and collaboratively define goals, which you explained as focus and then prioritize. I really appreciate the underlining the importance of combination of wide and deep engagement and co-creation, and also the importance of NBS providing social change, which is the focus of Clever Cities project and other sister NBS Horizon projects that are being developing the online co-creation supporting tool, decision support tool. We are really looking forward to using it in the future, and thank you for this really important announcement. Do you have any idea about when we will be able to see it online? And
unfortunately, I think the beta version, which won't be available to everybody, will only be in March of next year as our goal for the first beta version. After that, hopefully it would be probably mid next year before it's online.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot for this information. And yeah, I'm sure that in the discussion session, we will have questions about your experience in defining priorities and facilitating co-creation in South Thamesmead in London. But now I would like to invite Barbara to tell us a bit more about the relation of NBS and urban planning and how it can be used as an urban planning tool, and how not to think only about mapping, but see the whole value and potential of NBS in these spatial development processes.
Thank you, Anna, for this invitation. So yes, this occasion, I would like to share some of the ideas and thinking about the possible relationships or understanding of nature-based solutions as a driving force, or perhaps really even a tool for urban planning. The subject of my talk are related to the research which was conducted at the Urban Planning Institute at within different projects. So the main understanding of nature-based solutions within my presentation and my work follows the European Commission definition, which defines nature-based solutions as also shown here at the slide, solutions that are inspired and supported by nature, which are cost-effective, simultaneously provide environmental, social, and economic benefits, and help build resilience. So it points on quite some aspects, those social, environmental, and economic, reflecting actually nowadays quite large number of societal challenges, but also points on processes taking or following functions of nature. And looking at this definition, it recalls immediately that the ideas about the mobilization of nature and its processes as principles of spatial or urban planning are not new. For example, McHarg's, if we can still go back, I have a citation on the first slide, yes. So McHarg's approach from late 60s of the 20th century called design with nature. This was one of the most influential. And among other things, he actually believed that by working with, rather against the landscape's powerful forces and flows, communities would gain an increasingly strong sense of place and identity, which again is reflected in this social dimension of the NBS, which was brought up with the new European Commission definition. So that not only environmental or biodiversity important aspects, but also other aspects are included in that definition. And now, yes, Anna, we can move on. Thank you. But before going into this subject, addressing classification of nature-based solutions for the purpose of urban planning, I would still like to give some linkages between nature-based solutions and urban planning. Because although the nature-based solution as a concept is fairly defined and accepted today, there is still a lack of the adequate association with the nomenclatures immanent to urban planning. So how to translate, how to use what is hidden, what is captured within the nature-based solution idea for urban planning as directly as possible. So how to come closer to land use planning, morphology, build structure pattern, and so on. So there is a challenge to understand nature-based solutions within the parameters of urban planning, reflecting NBS, so nature-based solutions, in biotic and abiotic things. And especially this later are, for example, physical processes, such as geological matter and energy processes. And they are parts of nature. And in that sense, they are properties of location, which is the core subject of the spatial planning. And those properties are, for example, natural ventilation by wind flow, local materials availability, and even their use, including proximity of the sources. And then shading because of the steepness of the site, for example, or even when we already have built up situation, there is orientation of plant or built structures, and so on. So all them can be appropriately addressed as the abiotic components of nature. And thus, aside from the original connection of nature-based solutions to biodiversity, green infrastructure, and by this also to open space development via most biotic aspects of nature-based solutions, this is crucial to equally address also other aspects more related to this abiotic characteristics of places. So for building the pathway towards nature-based solutions as a tool for urban planning, we suggested a classification of nature-based solutions that simultaneously address two things: the role of natural processes in nature-based solutions and the ability of natural processes to deliver results to address the cities and urban environments development. So regarding the role of the natural processes, the NBS are classified into those only using natural processes, those using and mimicking natural processes, and those only mimicking natural processes. In terms of societal challenges, so this is the left part, we propose the categorization of the outcome or effect of the natural processes that the NBS intended to achieve into four main groups: greenhouse gases and mostly temperature reduction, urban water cycle management, noise reduction, and air quality improvement. And this information then was set up into the matrix, which I will briefly comment on in this. For example, we classified, as it is indicated already here, natural terrain with vegetation, retention ponds, and swales, for example, as NBS using natural processes. And then if we move on, we classified, for example, green roofs, vertical green, constructed wetlands, and similar as NBS using and mimicking natural processes, because they might be created not necessarily only based on natural ingredients. And in contrast, for example, pervious pavement, this belongs to the group of NBS that only mimics natural processes because it imitates natural processes without requiring the involvement of biotic things. And this is the last group where there are also other types of nature-based solutions put down. This research was done reading the various, mostly European Commission supported research projects, other studies. So we collected the types of solutions from various different sources. So we can move on, Anna, thank you. And this matrix's final purpose is then to show which concrete solution can best solve each problem or a set of problems in urban environments. And then I also put some examples here. So the solutions addressing challenges related to air quality and temperature, which are indicated here, for example, are mainly available, as you could see, in the NBS group, which uses natural components and processes. Then, yes, those addressing urban water cycles challenges are more evenly spread across the matrix. And then the analysis also indicated that nature-based solutions with the, we can move on. I didn't want to spend much more on that section because this, you could really see that we have for the water urban cycle question. Back up, please.
Sorry.
A lot of various solutions, but this one already indicated here. This analysis indicates that NBS with substantial vegetation in natural or rough terrains are the most versatile or in improving the widest range of problems. So this is what we did as a start, to try to learn what we have on board. But then, to enhance this matrix's applicable value for urban planning, we enlarge it with a simple classification of 4 urban patterns, comprising descriptions from which an area's basic spatial structure, character, also rough ownership structure can be deducted. And I presented them here with these A, B, C, and D examples with a short description, but also with an image. So if we have a look now on the matrix, we can see, for example, that the NBS that directly use natural processes, let's say natural terrain with substantial vegetation, which would mean in cities, for example, parks, especially in dense urban patterns. So if we have a look in column A, are generally more difficult to implement, mostly because of the space constraints. So when we are addressing the densely built areas or historic centers, then we might be sooner or later, we might need to consider looking solutions which are mimicking or actually combining mimic and using combination of natural and mimicking natural processes, because simply there might be not enough room for implementing, let's say, a big green space. This we can move on. Actually, we can discuss more details later. Okay, so with this slide, I want to point out that in addition to defining what problems nature-based solutions are solving, it is very important to define what conditions the site should meet for implementing these nature-based solutions. Also, what resources are needed for the operation of the solution and how to provide these resources. From the perspective of the rational use of resources and space, a key characteristics of NBS we concluded is actually that it tends to be or should to be as much as possible self-sustained. And another important thing is that a good understanding of the interaction effects of different nature-based solutions or the multiplicity of effects of individual nature-based solutions are very important to consider. From the urban planning point of view, for example, it is also crucial to define the impact's spatial extent. So how far away from where you place the nature-based solution somewhere, it will have an impact. So how far away it will solve the problem. And also the solution's impact area, so which is the important is also the impact area of availability of the resources required for that solutions. For example, if the sources and resources are far away, so then it might cause problems as well. It won't be as, let's say, nature-based as it could be, and it also addresses here the circularity and circular economy issues. So this is why I think nature-based solutions and urban planning are really interesting pairing, and other, contemporary thinking and approaches really find also place between them. Yes, we can move on. So here we are finally at mapping and map making, which is a traditional activity of urban planning. And it's still urban planning remains highly related to maps and map making. And we argue that the nature-based solutions related urban planning, in the nature-based solutions related urban planning, there is an opportunity actually to call for an approach in which an area of land for a certain use can be represented in a new manner and supplemented with other contextual information that might influence or guide the land's use. Going towards such concept, for example, firstly, I think we must consider how to build upon current planning practices. So how to use master plan, how to upgrade it, how to work with urban design, and how to upgrade it as the urban design document. And also to identify and evaluate sites' characteristics in terms of their appropriateness for nature-based solution placement. So we need to know how well our solution might fit in where we want to put it. And yes, if we now go a little bit more in depth to this first point, to build upon current urban planning practices, I think it's very important to bear in mind that graphically, let's say, and nature-based solutions cannot be represented as land use categories. However, they are solutions with an aerial impact, with dimensions. Therefore, some of their characteristics can be expressed graphically. Here I'm showing an example from the it's on the other, it's still on the other one, yes, from the strategic master plan of the municipality of Ljubljana. This master plan introduced a category called green system regime. It was first introduced already 2001, and then the master plan had been refined. So the last version is from a couple of years ago. And this regime is actually a transparent layer covering the appropriate areas of various land uses, from green areas, residential, forest, agriculture, and also land uses of transportation. But this layer communicates the necessity of managing places with different land uses in a way that ensures the functions and continuity of green infrastructure. So a layer with those lines, which you could see, it goes across, above the land uses. And this is perhaps a way which we could upgrade how to try to introduce nature-based solutions in a graphical parts of urban planning documents. Okay, and here I think is my last slide, which will give some points on the topic of identifying and evaluating sites' characteristics in terms of their appropriateness for nature-based solutions placement. Yes, the site's characteristics, rather than the site's characteristics, what I want to say here is rather than the individual nature-based solutions must be considered or shall be considered, including the site's natural processes, natural process dynamics, and other dynamic patterns. And through these characteristics, we must reflect on potential solutions that might best fit a location. So what I want to bring up here is awareness that there are also other dynamics in places, but natural dynamics. So here I'm also showing kind of social dynamics, social dimensions of places, because social aspect is also one of the aspects within the definition of nature-based solutions. And in relation to that, within the Connecting Nature project, which was European Commission funded project, which just ended recently, There were several sets of nature-based solutions related indicators developed, and there was also a set of so-called primary indicators, and they were addressing this kind of aspects on a very detailed level, such as frequency and duration of human activities in places. And these are, for example, maps showing you the dynamic patterns of users in some public open spaces in Edinburgh. And this can be also seen as a layer, as an input, you know, for further mapping when develop land use suggestions, which can be upgraded with various aspects of nature-based solutions. And here we are again with mapping and map making, with layers of possible related information to represent the multifunctional character of nature-based solutions and its complex nature for supporting or maybe even enabling urban planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'll just check if we have questions in the chat, but I think it's just the introductions of participants. In this context, I would like to ask Barbara to explain us a little bit more about the framework in which the research you presented us was developed. Was that the research done for the ministry, and how it was intended to be used in actual implementation in local context in Slovenia or other environments in Southeastern Europe? And maybe a bit more to reflect on your experience in the region. Are we the society with participatory culture or with low participatory culture, and how to tackle that challenge in our regional context?
Okay, yes, thank you for your question. The part of my presentation referring to this green matrix, yes, this was from the study we did for the Ministry of Spatial Planning and Environment of the Republic of Slovenia. Initially, the idea was to try to map the, good practices of nature-based solutions. But then when we started to do research, and we realized that it is so vaguely linked, the concept of nature-based solutions, to urban planning and to expectations and knowledges of urban planners. So then we shaped this research towards that direction, that results as shown today were actually resulted out of it. And it was really interesting project. We had a lot of discussions with the expert groups from the ministry, and at the end it really developed into an interesting composition, and it gives us a baseline for further research, and also towards instructions for planning practice, so not keeping us and this knowledge only within the academic sphere, but moving it towards the practice. The participation, I think this is really getting there now. I can give you two sorts of answers. Sometimes researchers from the Urban Planning Institute, we are invited as stakeholders who participate. So from that point of view, I can say there is participation really, it's growing, because different authorities are organizing sessions, events, asking various stakeholders to collaborate. And then as researchers, we at the Institute, we usually more or less also work on the new methods, new approaches, new ways how to do it, how to deal it, how to actually encourage, not so much on a way Sean was presented, but more practical inputs, how to encourage local authorities to do it, to go for it. And also here, the steps had been taken, and the participatory approaches, even for municipal spatial plans, are now really something what is not a novelty anymore. It's been there maybe for a couple of years, really accepted even within the last legislation addressing spatial planning, this is a kind of suggested by law, the process. It's a part of the spatial planning process.
Excellent and encouraging. Thank you, Barbara. We also have received a question from participants. Geoffrey Kwala asked, how do you create learning feedback loops in between projects that you have done across different communities with similar or same projects? It can be addressed by both Barbara and Sean. Maybe first Barbara, and then we'll give the floor to Sean and ask him other questions as well.
Yes, thank you for the question. There are always several ways. One is usually within the project as such, which has its own usually work package that has to take care of that. And then each partner on a local level does it its way. So mostly we really try to produce a leaflet or a short a brochure in a native language and then spread it. And then a lot of the times we accept interviews. So we are in the media, we talk with at the radio. So these are maybe this accepting an invitation for an interview or trying to attract the radio or television to ask, to invite you to tell about the novelties. This is quite effective, I think.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. And for Sean, the same question about creating learning feedback loops in between projects.
Yeah, I would agree with Barbara. It starts, there's always a project level upscaling and then the individual organizations. But I would also say that we have to think about celebrating initiatives. So that means communications and putting it on interesting videos and just really making a lot of noise about a successful initiative in that sense. Starting to give prizes and do contests to repeat and grants and things like that to repeat that process is also very interesting. You can also give a bit of a legal push and start to make those solutions obligatory. I mean, you can go down that pathway or both, usually all of these together. And then there's learning classes, going to a neighborhood and just either teaching technical people or local people about the process. And so it's many pathways forward that usually work all together.
Yes, thank you, Sean, for this answer. I think that learning classes are extremely important. And you mentioned in your presentations, awareness raising and education a couple of times. We really experience that it is a critical element of co-creation, especially in the cultures which are not so experienced in democratic processes of planning, but more like top down. I would like to ask you also about maybe some specific tools for evaluating the visions, the options, the goal setting that you used in South Thamesmead in London. You presented us the nice elaborative list, and I would just like to ask you for a bit of your own reflection from your facilitation and processes in London.
Yeah, we were in a bit of an, like I said, you work from your system context. So what South Thamesmead. So we had a situation with very few organized groups, and we didn't have a lot of groups to really reach out widely. And then on top of that, of course, was COVID in the middle. That pushed us to working with deep engagement. So our Community Design Council was perhaps overused. I would say that London didn't reach the right balance because of the digital use in the COVID. There's limits to what you can do. We set up a microsite to reach out across all of Thamesmead, but motivating people to use a microsite when there's so much digital content on is very difficult compared to just throwing a street festival with free food and music where people drop by and we can invite them into to participate. So there's these different options in terms of the context. So once we found out we were working in a more deep manner, or we did try to reach out widely, but we were focusing on a deep manner. That meant that we were able to use a lot of, like I said, tagged voting, where we would give options, and then everybody, single person in the group, would have 3 little tags, and you could vote multiple times. And then obviously the options that were most voted came up, and we worked in that sort of consensus basis. That was very common. What I've liked to introduce, but I wasn't able to do in Thamesmead, as I said, are systems diagrams. They're sort of a favorite now, where you work with the community and you develop it collectively, saying, well, if we change this, this impacts that. If we change that, it impacts that. And then people start to really see where the issues are collectively. So if I get a chance, I try to do that, but that we were unable to do that in Thamesmead in this project. Those would be just sort of 2 typical ones. But again, you just by collecting data and getting information, like I said, some certain things repeat and a number of objectives, and you start to, just your base data already sets things up. But I also wanted to point out how Barbara and my presentations are complementary. And so when I'm talking about, you can get information from communities, people saying, okay, well, like I said, there's not enough greenery here. That's just a vague thing. Whereas a technical group or somebody, as Barbara's pointing out, you get a heat map saying where you should put NBS. So 2 stakeholders with radically different information that you have to put together. A local resident saying, you know, it's not green enough, and a technical person showing up with this technical map showing exactly, you know, where the potentials are. The quality of information is radically different, and you have to bring those 2 together. The technical information typically has to get filtered through the community so that they can understand the technical information and make decisions, so it's a validated decision.
Exactly, that is actually the point about balancing the wide and deep, and yeah, the roles of different types of stakeholders. Maybe just for the end, the question about reaching out to the government structure. In the online tool, you presented the structure to government and then consolidate the government. How difficult or challenging was it to maybe question or test some different collaborative governance models and collaborative decision making?
Collaborative, how difficult it was to test? Again,
well, to implement in South Thamesmead, but yeah, actually to test, I guess, as a pilot to the regular procedure. Mm-hmm.
Again, if we compare the different cities, the main cities that were like the Milan and London and Hamburg, the front-runner cities, the contexts were very difficult. Whereas London, it was quite easy because we were under control of a housing estate, and they decided that they wanted to be more horizontal. They wanted to set up, they wanted to delegate power to a certain department, and then they wanted that department to include community groups in the decision-making process at a high level. So with one simple decision, a horizontal process was created because of the institutional structure in South Thamesmead. Whereas in Hamburg, there was all sorts of government institutions that had to approve and things like that. And they're still fighting with the different groups, and some groups wanted to be more horizontal and others didn't. And it was much more complicated than our city. So our city had something negative. We didn't have many people to work with, but we had a simple institutional process to make that process happen. Whereas Hamburg had lots of community organizations to work with, but they had a complex institutional network to deal with in terms of approvals. So again, finding the right medicine for your context is really important.
Thank you very much, Sean. Really important message. Maybe I would like to end this webinar content with this discussion. I would like to announce now that our next meeting online will be on October 18th. We will be discussing the step 4 of the UrbanByNature methodology, which is about committing and planning, actually about proposing concrete activities and defining concrete financial instruments. We will have very interesting presentations about urban greening plans instruments, introduced by European Biodiversity Strategy. So we are really looking forward to seeing you again all in October at another webinar. And just the last notice is that all the recordings from our webinars you can see at the Cities with Nature YouTube channel, as Cities with Nature is actually hosting the Urban by Nature program. And last information, we would like to make this exchange of information and knowledge within our hub co-creative as well, and not just from panelists towards the participants. So here you can see the link about the Urban by Nature survey, and we warmly invite you to fill it in, and also register for Urban by Nature newsletter, or digest as we call it. And thank you very much to our panelists, to all the organizational team, to all the participants, and we are very much looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar.